Professor Benikoff, who's been really a pioneer in this area of law and technology and dispute resolution, and worked with a good friend of mine, Ethan Catch, with the National Center for Technology and Dispute Resolution, and true pioneers in this area. So thank you very much for having me. And certainly if you have questions along the way, please let me know. I think I can talk loudly enough that it's okay if I kind of walk around or... So what am I going to talk about today? And it's kind of interesting that the title of my presentation is The Dangers of Digitizing Due Process. Now I'll have you know that if you talk to any of my friends or if you talk to other professors or other people I know, they would say, you're going to talk about the dangers of digitizing due process? Because I've been talking about ODR and online dispute resolution for many years, so it sort of seems crazy that I would actually say there's dangers to digitizing due process. Because it seems as though we want to empower, right? And so I go back to, I come from a place, as the professor was saying, with respect to consumer remedies and concerns about access to justice, essentially mainly in areas where people can't otherwise afford a lawyer. In the United States, as it is here, it's very difficult to get a lawyer in a small dollar claim. It can be, even someone who makes a moderate income is not able to actually obtain justice. So the idea is, how can we expand access to justice? So it got me into thinking of different types of online dispute resolution. Now, online dispute resolution, let me ask you, how many of you have gone through online dispute resolution? How many of you have ever sent an email to somebody regarding a dispute? How many of you gone on Twitter and perhaps complained about a company or gone on Facebook? There are a lot of different ways that we use computer-mediated communications to resolve disputes. And there's a lot of different phases to it, right? So it can be conflict prevention, right? So problem diagnosis through maybe automated processes that provide buyers and sellers, at least in the consumer space, information about their rights. It can be very empowering. The consumer empowerment class that I mentioned, I teach as a service learning class where I go with the students into the community. And part of empowering consumers is providing information. Direct negotiation, different online tools that can help facilitate negotiation and help you provide get to yes, as we like to say in the area of negotiation. Of course, you can bring in a third party who can join the discussion and actually facilitate online mediations. And it's great fun with my students. We do simulations in the ODR, or dispute resolution digital age, and it's fun to sort of test these different things out with my students and see how it plays out and how you feel when you're in that context. Finally, online evaluation, where there's an endpoint to ODR. Some kind of an endpoint. That could be through online arbitration. It could even be crowdsourced dispute resolution. So why move any conflict? Why not always work with face-to-face? For example, in the world of ADR, alternative dispute resolution, we talk all about empathy and the importance, and we work with, in fact, when I took ADR, when I was in law school, I took it in the school of psychology, it was with psychology. And it was kind of coming from this idea of building trust with face-to-face, right? That whole idea. So why move it online? Well, first of all, litigation and face-to-face, even arbitration and mediation, is just plain too expensive. Okay, and especially, again, you have to understand the United States, they enforce pre-dispute arbitration clauses. Well, it's very expensive then to actually assert your claims if you are subject to an arbitration clause. Consumers also, there was a study done by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in the United States, and they looked at, well, how do people want to get remedies? And it was interesting to show that 85% preferred online access to having to pick up the phone. I don't know if you've ever been there, you felt that pain of having to pick up the phone and call customer service, right? And you don't know what you're going to get because different representatives provide different deals. You call at 10 a.m., they say, I can't help you. You call at 2 p.m., they're like, oh, you get your money back. I mean, there's sort of no real consistency. Also, the use of data and online neutrals can actually assist resolution. Even something as simple as adapting language and having different education levels, having it mobile friendly, being able to deal with physical and time differences if I'm a single mom and I have to work full time, I can't probably show up at court between 9 to 5. It's more accessible for me to file a claim online. The idea of providing remedies and holding companies liable in small dollar claims is really difficult in this day and age. In my own empirical research, what I found, and I didn't go out looking for it, but what I found is that we have essentially a squeaky wheel system, right? The people who feel empowered, the people who have the most access to education, to lawyers, they're the ones, the squeaky wheels who can sit at home and make all the phone calls. They're most likely to actually get the remedy. So again, online dispute resolution, the idea that it will open up access to justice. We'll go through this quickly. Again, as I was trying to portray, is, it can be consumer complaint sites. It can be just clicking the button to dispute a charge on your credit card. Those are basically online methods of dispute resolution. At the same time, over the course of the last 20 years, really, we've seen a huge growth of sort of internal private online dispute resolution systems. Some of the most famous systems are eBay, Amazon, Alibaba. They have online dispute resolution systems, and their idea was that it builds the customers keep coming back for more. They keep coming back because they know that if I buy something on Amazon, that it's very easy to get a remedy if the goods don't arrive or they don't arrive as promised. So you have a private industry groundswell of online dispute resolution that's been happening over the last 20 years. At the same time, the EU has created an online dispute resolution platform, and we have that up and running throughout the European Union. Meanwhile, there's ODR in Asia, Latin America, South Africa. An article, if anyone's interested, app for that is the name of my title, that came out last year that really looks at all of these growing ODR systems throughout the world, including developing nations. So finally, kind of just giving you the picture of how we've come around, is then came UNCITRAL, which is the United Nations Commission for International Trade Law, and they created this working group for the development of ODR for e-commerce global cross-border claims. And so a lot of us thought, here we are, we were part of it, this is going to happen. It felt as though everybody agreed that this is good for consumer claims, especially in e-commerce. It seemed like, well, that's a no-brainer. We all got real excited. It was like this group of cheerleaders, meeting at these meetings twice a year in Vienna or in New York, and thought it was all going to come out. Well, guess what? 2016, it ended because there was no consensus on the procedural rules, and it broke into some kind of odd little battles. And one of them was about specifically this, is pre-dispute arbitration clauses. And you'll see why this matters later in the talk, because what we learned and what we saw was there's no global consensus on this idea of online arbitration, right? This idea of, yes, we like the idea of moving things online and including more access to remedies and access to justice through ODR, but there's a definite fear of these kind of final and binding processes that could take away our self-determination and our rights, or our consent. My experience, again, I was one of 4 experts in 2014, and what we were trying to do is kind of outside of the regular meetings, we were working on these different rules of procedural fairness. So there was some consensus there. So even though I kind of talked about the negative, there was kind of some positive, right? So there was a group of people starting to think about ethics and starting to think about procedural reforms that might be necessary as we launch into this brave new world of using technology in dispute resolution. So where did this leave us? So at that time, we thought, well, gosh, we're not going to give up. Because in the room, there was some consensus. There was some movement. We've got to do something about this lack of access to justice. We've got to do something to open up essentially a virtual door to the courthouse. So I worked with another, Colin Wu, who created the systems for eBay and PayPal, and here I was, the academic, the consumer protection person, and I thought, the only way I'm going to really learn is if I fly out to Silicon Valley and I see what they're doing, and I try to kind of learn everything I can from the industry, right? Get out of your silo and go learn from others. And so that's kind of became what we did, and we thought, well, we've got to work on contextual design. A lot of times we talk about fitting the forum to the fuss. Have you heard that? Well, the idea is doing a functional analysis. The idea of creating and designing a system that actually solves the problem that you have, right? So if you have a tax dispute or you've got a consumer dispute, the system is designed in such a way that it's going to help you to actually solve that kind of dispute. In other words, what I also learned during the course of the UNCTRAL working group is that you can't have one system for all disputes. And at one point they were trying to do that. And what I learned is that, at least I feel, that you can't really do that. You've got to fit the form to the fuss, meaning trying to create a system that is best for that particular type of dispute. Finally, insistence on consent and leaving doors to the court open. In light of things such as the digital divide and different access to computers, different comfort with computers. In fact, the research shows very clearly that there's a digital divide according to age. Even in a very recent, in fact, just last week it came out, there was a survey that was done by the National Center for State Courts in the United States, and what they did is they asked different people, well, how would you feel about tax disputes being resolved online? How would you feel about traffic ticket disputes being decided online? And what they found was that for people over 50, there was a very low percentage of approval. In fact, the only area where a majority approved of online for the group over 50 was with respect to traffic tickets. But as you go younger, there's much more sort of acceptance. I mean, people date online, they go to therapists online, people are more calm. It's just a different sort of acceptance of technology. So that's what the new handshake, we kind of set out a blueprint with Colin Rule, and that kind of was this idea of creating essentially trust. How do you rebuild trust in the marketplace by creating a system that's so good that consumers are going to want to use this in order to get a remedy? But the only problem is, once again, you gotta be not afraid to, as I like to say, fail forward, right? So kind of like, oh, that's kind of ambitious, right? So we thought, oh, we're gonna create this one platform, consensual, easy and free for consumers, visible for auditors and consumer agencies. And I still hope that this utopian vision is gonna happen, where the consumer reports the issue, they get it worked out, the merchant can respond, they get to post a trust mark by opting into this system and depositing funds. The consumer can choose which door they want. Would they rather just, maybe the merchant will just give them a remedy automatically in order to garner goodwill? Will we go to some kind of online mediation or negotiation? Or possibly some sort of mass claim process that could happen in the areas of class actions? Well, what we learned, and is most important, is how do we get buy-in, right? So again, we were kind of arguing for this blueprint of how companies could come together and create a consortium and essentially have this global online process that was monitored by Consumers International. Well, we have to get buy-in, right? So how do we kind of proceed? And that brings me, I think, to the current stage that we're in. So ODR history started in kind of private companies and a lot of private development, especially in the United States. But now what we're seeing is buy-in and this kind of groundswell of online dispute resolution and e-courts that are part of the public justice system, that are moving into public courts. Think about it, that's different, right? Because now you're not talking about something where it's because I bought something on eBay or I bought something on PayPal. Now it's actually part of the court process. And in fact, I should update these slides already because it is just amazing. I've been working with different groups, and kind of the National Center for State Courts in the United States is partnering with this Pew Charitable Trust. You also have a lot of states that are just creating their own systems. And what's happening is every day, new online processes are being implemented in the courts. And this is definitely happening in the United States. Let me give you some examples. Ohio is a very robust example. Ohio has partnered with Matterhorn, which is a private company, private ODR provider, and they do ODR for property taxes. I believe their small claims might even be working with Modria, which is part of Tyler Technologies. So that all that is to say is you have a lot of private companies that are partnering with the courts in the United States to provide online dispute resolution. Similarly, in Michigan, traffic tickets. So what they have done is they've moved basically a lot of the dispute resolution that comes to your traffic tickets, if you want to contest a ticket, to an online process. And the empirical data is very promising, right? Because it does open up more doors to the courthouse. It's great for the state because guess what? They're collecting more money because it makes for easy payment, especially if you're somebody who's caught for speeding and you're from out of state. There's a lot of jurisdictional issues otherwise. New York, now New York is interesting because I was on a steering committee and we were looking originally to create an online dispute resolution system for debt collection cases. As you might imagine, debt collection is an area where debtors cannot really get a fair shake. It's very difficult to actually get an attorney to represent you in those kinds of cases because why? They're probably not going to make very much money. And so essentially what happened is we thought, okay, we're going to build this system. It's going to be great for helping debtors get some kind of remedy in these debt collection cases. What was interesting is the pushback. And again, it's going to show you how making a mistake can be fatal. We didn't invite everybody. Now that I think about it, not everyone was at the table. Not everyone was there, meaning the judges, legal aid, court administrators, people who are fear legitimately losing their jobs through online processes, right? So you got to get everyone on there wasn't that kind of buy-in. So then you got to the point where you're like, yippee, we're ready to launch. And then the legal community said, we don't like this at all. This is not going to go anywhere. In fact, the legal aid community also felt, well, this is not going to really help our constituents. And so at the end of the day, that died. So there will be not an online process for debt collection. But it was interesting because it wasn't a bad process. The process itself is actually very fair, would have been really a benefit. But lesson learned, everyone regrouped and said, you know what, we need to bring in everybody to the table, and now they are currently in the process of creating a system for small claims. Okay, so there will be a system up and running in New York for small claims. Utah is interesting because Utah is thinking about moving all small claims to online, meaning closing the other doors. The idea is there's a fear that, well, if we leave the in-person, face-to-face traditional door open to the courthouse, no one's going to use the online process. So how do we get people to use this bright, shiny new online process that we created? So we need to close that door in order to make sure that people use the online door. And this is what we're going to talk about. This is how somebody who's the biggest cheerleader for online dispute resolution says, well, wait a minute, I think there's a danger to going too fast and too far without thinking about considered design. Again, e-courts and public ODR, I want to be sure we understand, U.S. is far behind. In fact, you are world leaders. Canada is definitely the world leader when it comes to online dispute resolution in the courts. You have the CRT, you've got the Cyber Justice Laboratory, we've got different processes that have been around, and a true world leader. Interestingly, China is also really out at the forefront, and they have the Hangzhou Internet Court. I wrote their bias concerns because there's some research that, well, so Alibaba is located there and they tend to win most of their cases, so we can sort of wonder about that. All right, the UK, Her Majesty's online court, you probably heard about this. So, and there's a lot, and I'm going to be writing a lot of this will be in the paper, but what they're doing is they're moving a lot of processes online. And the real impetus for the project, though, really was an austerity measure, right? So that courts could save money. But now there's kind of pushback, and the Legal Education Foundation in London, they're kind of saying, well, wait a minute, let's kind of push pause, and let's make sure that this is done fairly. But there's tension there, right? Because you have privacy issues versus efficiency issues versus fairness, and fairness and efficiency especially like to do battle. Then, of course, the EU platform. But, you know, there's kind of a differentiation. Different countries are implementing it in different ways, and it's unclear how much use is happening. So what are kind of some of the takeaways, and how do we kind of, this whole new world, right? So you have the history and the private development, and within companies, now it's moving into public development, and you're taking off, and in fact, there's like 50 projects going on in the United States right now alone. So this is all kind of, what are some of the big takeaways? Where are the areas where we see kind of it growing by most quickly, right? And then we can think about where it might go, but contextual dispute resolution, fitting the form to the fuss, what are some of these areas? Small claims, definitely. And again, mainly consensual and non-binding for the most part, but we might be seeing that moving more into a mandatory small claims, like we're going to see in Utah. Tax appeals, definitely, there's mainly pilot projects, but Ohio has been up and running for some time. And in looking at the data coming out of Ohio with respect to tax disputes, it's actually quite favorable, that it looks like there's a lot more sort of consensual, and satisfaction is very high, the levels of satisfaction. And of course, traffic tickets, consensual and non-binding. The reason I put a star on that is in the recent survey, as I said earlier, that is the one area where there's consensus, regardless of your age, in terms of allowing for and welcoming online dispute resolution for traffic disputes. Family context. Now, I put private providers there because this is an interesting universe. There are many, I shouldn't say many, but quite a few online dispute resolution private providers that are partnering with courts, okay, to provide online dispute resolution and online mechanisms for working on things like parenting plans and divorce agreements. Some examples equal co-parenter. Co-parenter is working with a lot of different courts in California, and the idea is that then you can help people work out through direct negotiation and sometimes bringing in a third-party professional that may not be a lawyer but may actually be a therapist to try to help people work out things like parenting plans, figuring out your holidays, figuring out your separation agreement and your property disputes. And so there's a lot of that happening, but it's mainly with a lot of private providers. Tyler Technologies, though, however, does have a family law online dispute resolution system as well. But I think you're seeing the theme, which is that there's a lot of private and public partnerships that are happening in the United States. And we can really kind of think about that. Is that good? Is that bad? It's a fact right now, but the question is whether or not that's problematic. As we know, condo claims here in Canada, you definitely have a movement in that area for online dispute resolution. So, with all this going on, it's no surprise that, of course, a group of people interested in online dispute resolution have formed this International Center for Online Dispute Resolution and International Council for Online Dispute Resolution. And I happen to be a part of this, and please go to iCoder. If you go to the website, you can kind of see more about it. And what we're trying to do, and kind of bringing you full circle, so we're worried because you have all these different providers coming out, private providers, also public, that are coming out and creating these systems, and it's kind of the bright, shiny new thing. And the question is, are you going more toward efficiency? Are you going toward fairness? Are you balancing the two? Well, you got to push pause there and say, well, wait a minute. We need to have proper design that takes into account ethics and due process, because there are dangers to digitizing due process. There are dangers to rushing toward the bright, shiny new thing without thinking about what we're doing and making sure that we're protecting what justice should be, especially when these are public projects. So this is just an initial list. And when you look at these lists, it's funny, I was pulling up a bunch of different documents from the Legal Education Foundation in London, from the National Center for State Courts, and they all kind of list similar things, right? We're all kind of looking at this wish list. And if you're sitting there, if I were you, I'd be skeptical, like, okay, what does this really mean? But it's at least a starting place. And from there, what we're going to do, what we need to do is kind of drill down on specifics that go under each of these. But these are the basics. Accessibility. Thinking of it being easy for the parties to find, to even find it at all, and to participate in it, and not limit their right to representation, to be available both mobile and desktop. Mobile friendly is very important because cell phones have helped to narrow the digital divide by leaps and bounds. Cell phones turned out, mobile technology turns out to be the only way that many people access the internet. Also, being able to easy for people with different physical ability levels. In fact, I presented at a conference in Australia, and that was our main focus, was just thinking about physical differences and how you really address that when you're creating an online system. Maybe using AI, using more voice recognition, right? There's a lot of things we can do if we're creative. Accountability, continuously accountable to the institutions, legal frameworks, and communities they serve, competent, run by people with the relevant expertise. Not having somebody who, for example, in one meeting I noticed we didn't even have any technologists at the table. And we were talking about what needed to be done. Well, how can you really talk about that if you don't have anybody who actually understands the technology itself? Confidential, respectful of parties' communications and in line with policies that must be made around who sees what data and how that data can be used. Because that's actually, in the US especially, everyone just assumes, well, you gotta capture your data because we gotta make money on the data. We sell the data. I mean, that's a big, big business. Axiom in the United States knows everything about everyone. They have secret consumer scores out on you, and when you call in the United States, you never know if you get the A team or the B team with customer service because you're essentially scored by these different agencies and companies. So data, as it turns out, is very, very useful to companies. So how do we cabin that? How do we make it used in an ethical way? Equal, respect for all the participants, including those that are often silenced or marginalized. That can be important. Fair, impartial, neutral, obviously provided without bias, but that can be, even in a nuanced level. Legal, in accordance with the laws of all relevant jurisdictions. That becomes very important when you think about different types of processes. For example, if you are dealing with compensation claims, or you are dealing with landlord-tenant in the United States where there's a lot of different nuances to the rules and regulations in one city versus one county versus, it's all very disjointed. So you have to create a system that's legal within that jurisdiction. Again, secure, super important, transparent. Now it's interesting, on the one hand you want privacy, and on the other hand you want transparency. Do we see a tension there? Right? You want to keep it all private and you don't want anyone to use it, but then we do want transparency, basically taking away, just anonymize, I can never say that word, data, where you take away the personal identifiable information and you do audits on the system in a fair manner. Again, drilling down, there we have our big, but I just want to, again, just put the exclamation point on designing systems and dispute system design and thinking about, again, combating asymmetries. Thinking about the private, you might have heard about the repeat player syndrome. Mm-hmm. So we got to think about that. We have to make sure that the one-shotters, that the you and me, that the consumers have access to remedies. That it's not as though whoever owns the process always wins. Addressing the digital divide, right? Again, as I said earlier, mobile friendly, voice access. Thinking about always leaving the traditional doors open. Back in the Pound conference, when they talked about ADR, alternative dispute resolution, the idea is the multi-door courthouse, right? The idea that you would open up more doors to the courthouse. You have mediation, you can have negotiation, you have arbitration, and you've got your regular traditional trial. Why can't ODR be another door to the courthouse, right? Why can't it just be another virtual door that offers something that's so helpful where somebody especially does not have any other access to a lawyer or to remedies that can provide a remedy? Binding versus non-binding. I put a star on that because it brings us full circle to a lesson learned. When you insist on these kind of pre-dispute arbitration clauses that are going to close your door to other remedies, that's going to be problematic. So maybe at the outset we better say it's non-binding, right? And if people want to follow that process, they will. And in fact, the work even that eBay did with its own process, they found that most of the time people always agreed to the evaluation, or they got it done with negotiation. In fact, their research, even with Cyber Justice Laboratory, has shown that people's self-determination and being able to negotiate a dispute is actually where people find the most satisfaction. They feel satisfaction because they want self-determination. Again, security, privacy, confidentiality, and artificial intelligence and algorithms. Is it coming? Is it happening? Yes, of course it is. There's no way to stop it at this point. I mean, it's happening. Just yesterday, I saw Estonia is spending a lot of money on having these kind of online robo judges, this idea that we would have more use of online. In fact, in China, they also have that as well. It's Zhaofeng, I think is the name of it, but you can enter in different questions and provide legal answers. Right, so there's this fear that, you know, robots are going to take over the world and none of us are going to have jobs, and why are you even in law school? I mean, what's the point, right? We don't matter. Wrong, wrong. If you do it right and you make it an extra tool in your toolbox, it can actually make you a better lawyer. It means that things like EQ tend to matter more. Of course, there's a theoretical basis of concern for AI. And you may have seen some of this, but we have to kind of stop, and I am a professor, so I've got to bring in a theory. We've got to talk a little bit about theory here. But it's very legitimate, right? Because there's this kind of dignitarian view, right? It's kind of this ew factor, right? Like it's kind of like, ugh, I don't really want to trust the robot, right? I mean, this is like, there's just a bad feeling about it, right? And that's dignitarian versus consequentialist, where you're more focused on what are the repercussions. Right, so we can definitely worry when we hear that companies like Compass, you might have heard about this, it was being used for sentencing, and you know, got a bad rap, right? Because you're talking about sentencing, you're talking about bail, you're talking about bias. So we've got to make sure, and there's a garbage in, garbage out factor. We have to make sure that the baseline, that the data that's being used is not skewed in any one direction. We've got to make sure there's accounting, that there's audits on the system. Additional concerns for public OER. I just wanted to add this because, again, some of it is redundant, but what I really learned, even with the New York project, with some of these other projects with the National Center for State Courts, there's this augmented due process concern because you're talking about state action. And under the Constitution in the United States, for sure, there's a special duty that they have as the courts, as the public. Which means that when you talk about these ethical duties, when you talk about due process, it kind of raises it to a higher level. Public perception and fear of digitalization, as I was saying, is super important. The whole idea about the new handshake was that we wanted to provide something that would build trust. Because right now, in a lot of areas, there's not that kind of trust. We're fearful of what technology is doing. Is it there just to take away our rights? How can it actually provide more remedies? I was saying at lunch how I always kind of like to check myself on some of this when I get really excited, like, oh, technology is going to provide this, and dream big, and let's shoot for the moon, and we have all these great ideas. And then I'll just stop and I'll think, I'm going to see what my mom and dad say, okay? Because my mom and dad live middle of nowhere, Wisconsin. They never go on the internet. They're not going to be interested. And to kind of think about how can we create something that would actually be useful to my mom and dad, right? So how can I explain it? How can we think about everybody and make sure everyone is considered? Politics, startup costs, and lost jobs. That's huge. It is huge. In fact, that was also another big issue in New York, was this thought of lawyers, even though they were the same lawyers who never would have taken those cases at all anyway, they probably wouldn't have represented that particular debtor, but they were still very worried that these online processes were going to take away. Again, I go back, I don't think it's going to take away lawyer jobs, I think it helps create better jobs and helps sift out the people who have those additional skills, who have EQ, who are willing to innovate. Startup costs. The other point is things like, it's hard to kind of talk a state into, they have to have a champion, right? So if you are a government, if you're a municipality, if you're a court, and you're thinking, do I want the startup costs? Meaning, if you have to pay a lot of money to some of these private OER providers in order to provide OER, then that's a problem. I think what's really great and amazing and revolutionary with Cyber Justice Lab and trying to be saying is, because it's open source, because there is kind of more of that collaborative atmosphere makes it more accessible. Again, transparency versus privacy, fairness versus efficiency. In fact, these are just age-old questions. Finally, some ideas. So I brought up, kind of some of the hurdles. We thought about how this kind of comes full circle. On one hand, we definitely want to bring people together. I'm going to be working with the American Bar Association, with ICODER, with the National Center for State Courts, with the American Law Institute, and with other international groups we're trying to create, again, these kind of ideas and protocols for fairness and ethics, but, you know, at the end of the day, everybody could ignore us, right? They could say, that's great, you do that, but they aren't going to necessarily comply. So what you've got to do is you've got to sort of get buy-in. And to do that, you don't want to sort of, if you address the disruption that is caused by technology, you don't want people to fear that they're going to lose their jobs. You try to sort of create ways that we can adapt. Create a training system maybe where you start small in one municipality with tax disputes, for example. And then if you then have those people train other municipalities. In fact, in the class that I teach on online dispute resolution, the students work on a project during the course of the semester, and then they propose a system for resolving a particular type of dispute. And one of the students, in fact, that was her idea. She thought, well, that would be great because you can actually have other court administrators teaching other court administrators how to implement and use these different online systems instead of worrying about losing their jobs. But this is where I always talk about with my students, especially, is job gain, right? So it's an opportunity. It's not going to close the door for students. It's an opportunity for students to get involved in things like online dispute resolution. Because EQ actually, to be able to deal with the public and explain how this should be built, being able to help in the contextual design of the process. These are all absolutely necessary. And like I just like to say, capacity to fail forward, meaning being willing to innovate, being willing to try something new, not being afraid of moving forward into the next realm, right? That can actually be very valuable. Creativity, ideas like ODR kiosks, and having those available in libraries with people who are willing to help them and work through some of these online dispute resolution systems, that could still be a benefit. For example, let's say you've got a kiosk in the library, and that kiosk there's someone there who can actually assist you. Someone like my mom, she would use that, right? She'd feel more comfortable because there was someone there to help walk her through it. Then the next time she wouldn't need that assistance. But sometimes it takes a first try. I'm guilty of that. The first time that I'm going to try something new, I definitely like a little assistance. Flexibility, adapting systems as metrics emerge. I do think this is exciting that you have different groups that are starting to really focus on the data and looking at the data and thinking about how you can then react and address the data that's developed, which is what you are all doing here. But it's going to be a failure for those who remain static or that rush to digitize without proper user-focused dispute system design. In conclusion, and I'm going to open it up to questions, it's not simple to design and build OER systems that are sufficiently secure, easy, fair, and effective. There are key debates about cost, security, scope, consent, and trust. This will continue. There's even a debate about what is an e-court versus what is OER. I mean, these are all in the early stages, right? But, you know, if we do it right, then we can help advance access to justice and open more doors to the courthouse. So I guess I want to open it up to you and see what kinds of questions you have for me.